The pine woods behind our ranch still smell the same after all these years. That sharp, clean scent of resin and mountain air that used to follow my older brother Jacob home every evening when he'd return from his wandering. I can close my eyes and hear his boots on the porch boards, the creak of the kitchen door, and always that soft melody drifting from his harmonica as he settled into Pa's old chair by the window. 15 years have passed since Jacob walked into those woods and never came back, but some mornings, I swear, I can still hear that harmonica calling through the trees. I was 17 then, still young enough to believe that brothers were permanent fixtures in your life, solid as fence posts and just as reliable. Jacob was 22, with hands that could gentle a spooked horse or craft a whistle from a willow branch with equal skill. He had our mother's dark eyes and our father's stubborn jaw, and he played that silver harmonica like it held all the secrets of the world inside its metal chambers. The instrument had belonged to our grandfather, passed down through 3 generations of men who understood that sometimes music was the only way to speak what words couldn't carry. That October morning started like any other, with frost silvering the pasture grass and smoke rising thin and straight from our chimney into the still air. Jacob had been restless for weeks, pacing the house like a caged wolf, staring out at the pine ridge that marked the far boundary of our land. He'd taken to walking those woods more and more, sometimes staying out past sunset, returning with pine needles in his hair, and that distant look in his eyes that meant he was wrestling with something bigger than himself. I was splitting kindling when he emerged from the house that morning, the harmonica already in his shirt pocket where it always rode, creating a small square bulge against the faded blue fabric. He paused at the edge of the porch, one hand resting on the rail, and looked back at me with something I couldn't name then, but recognize now as goodbye. The morning light caught the silver of his harmonica as he pulled it out and played a few soft notes, a melody I'd never heard before, but somehow knew I'd carry with me forever. The last thing I saw was his figure disappearing between the tall pines, the autumn light filtering through the branches and breaking his silhouette into fragments of shadow and gold. I kept splitting wood, the rhythm of the axe keeping time with the fading echo of his music, never thinking that some sounds, once they fade, never come back. The harmonica's voice grew fainter as Jacob moved deeper into the woods, until finally there was nothing but the whisper of wind through the needles and the hollow thunk of my axe biting into dry cedar. By evening, when the sun had set behind the western peaks and Jacob still hadn't returned, I felt the first cold finger of worry touch my spine. Pa was already gone by then, taken by pneumonia the winter before, and Ma had followed him that spring, leaving just Jacob and me to work the ranch and keep each other company through the long mountain winters. We were used to solitude, but this felt different, like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something that might never come. I called his name until my voice went hoarse, walking the familiar trails with a kerosene lantern that threw dancing shadows between the trees. The pine woods seemed to swallow my shouts, giving back only the distant hoot of an owl and the rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush. I knew every path and clearing within miles of our ranch, had hunted and trapped in those woods since I was old enough to carry a rifle. But that night they felt foreign and hostile, as if the trees had rearranged themselves while I wasn't looking. 3 days passed before the sheriff arrived from town, a weathered man named Hutchins, who'd seen enough missing persons to know the difference between someone who'd gotten lost and someone who'd chosen to disappear. He brought 2 deputies and a tracking dog, a bloodhound with sad eyes and a nose that could follow a week-old trail through running water. They found Jacob's tracks easily enough at first, boot prints in the soft earth near Pine Creek, but the trail seemed to vanish after about a mile, as if my brother had simply walked off the face of the earth. The search lasted 2 weeks, with volunteers from neighboring ranches combing every canyon and ridge for miles around. We found nothing, not a scrap of clothing or a sign of struggle, nothing to suggest what might have happened to a strong young man who knew those woods better than most men knew their own backyards. The harmonica was missing too, of course, gone with Jacob into whatever mystery had claimed him. Sometimes, during those long nights of searching, I thought I heard its faint melody drifting through the darkness, but it was always just the wind playing tricks with my desperate ears. When the search was finally called off, I was left alone on the ranch with nothing but questions and the terrible silence where Jacob's music used to be. The house felt too big and too quiet, every room echoing with his absence, every evening meal a reminder that I was setting one plate instead of two. I kept his harmonica case on the kitchen table for months, that worn leather box sitting empty and open like a mouth waiting to be fed, until finally I couldn't stand the sight of it anymore and put it away in the attic with the rest of the things I couldn't bear to look at but couldn't bring myself to throw away. 15 years is long enough for a man to build a life, lose it, and build another one from the scraps. I married Rachel McKinnon in the spring of '91, a schoolteacher from Denver, with gentle hands and a laugh that reminded me just enough of my mother's to ease the lonely ache in my chest. We had 2 children, Emma and little Thomas, and for a while the house felt alive again, filled with the sounds of family and the everyday chaos that makes a place feel like home instead of just shelter. But even with a wife and children, even with the ranch prospering and the future looking bright as a new penny, there was always that empty space at the dinner table where Jacob should have been. Rachel understood, bless her, never pushing me to talk about my brother when the mood turned dark, never suggesting that maybe it was time to move on or let go. She'd seen the way I'd pause sometimes while working in the yard, listening for a harmonica that would never play again. And she knew that some wounds don't heal so much as they learn to live quiet. The children grew up hearing stories about their Uncle Jacob, the brother who could charm birds from trees and play music that made grown men weep. Emma inherited his musical ear, picking out melodies on the old piano we'd moved down from the attic, while Thomas had his restless spirit, always wandering off to explore the woods, despite my warnings about staying close to home. I taught them both to respect the pine forest, but not to fear it, though I'll admit there were nights when Thomas came home late that I felt that old familiar chill of dread. The ranch prospered through the years. Cattle prices stayed steady, and we added 100 acres to the north when old Henderson decided to sell. I hired help during roundup season. Good men who worked hard and didn't ask too many questions about the brother who'd vanished into thin air. Most folks in the valley knew the story by then, the way these things become part of local folklore, but they had the courtesy to keep their speculation to themselves when I was within earshot. Every autumn, when the aspens turned gold and the first frost touched the pasture grass, I'd find myself walking the old trails where Jacob used to roam, never searching anymore, not after all these years, but just walking and remembering, trying to keep some part of him alive in the familiar rhythm of boots on pine needles and the whisper of wind through the branches. Sometimes I'd stop at Pine Creek and listen to the water running over stones, imagining I could hear an echo of his music in the gurgle and splash. Rachel would watch me go on these walks with worry in her green eyes, understanding that this was something I needed to do, but wishing I could find some other way to honor my brother's memory. She'd suggested once that we hold a proper memorial service, give Jacob a headstone in the family plot, even without a body to bury, but somehow that felt like admitting defeat. As long as there was no grave, there was still a chance, however small, that the mystery might someday reveal itself. The town changed over the years, growing from a collection of ranches and a general store to something that almost deserved to be called a proper community. New families moved in, drawn by the clean air and the promise of land that could still be had cheap if you weren't afraid of hard work. The railroad came through in '97, bringing with it a steady stream of travelers and the first hints that the Old West was slowly giving way to something newer and more complicated. I served as sheriff for 6 years after Hutchins retired, partly out of civic duty, but mostly because I thought it might give me access to information that could help solve Jacob's disappearance. I worked every missing person case that came through the office with extra care, always hoping that one of them might provide some clue or pattern that would unlock the mystery of my brother's fate. But people disappear for all kinds of reasons, most of them mundane, and the woods keep their secrets as well as any vault. The harmonica case remained in the attic all those years, gathering dust among the other remnants of our family's past. Sometimes when I was up there looking for Christmas decorations or summer clothes, I'd see it sitting in the corner and feel that old familiar ache, but I never opened it. What was the point? The case was empty, just as my brother's room was empty. Just as the silence between the pine trees was empty of his music. Some things are better left untouched, sealed away like specimens in a jar where time can't corrupt them further. But silence has a weight of its own, and after 15 years it had grown heavy enough to bend a man's shoulders. I found myself listening more intently than ever, straining to catch some sound that might break the endless quiet where Jacob's harmonica used to play. Every evening when the work was done and the family settled in for the night, I'd sit on the porch and listen to the woods, hoping against hope that somewhere in that vast green darkness a familiar melody might still be playing. The storm that brought Jacob back to me, or at least brought back a piece of him, came roaring down from the Canadian peaks on a Tuesday night in late September. Lightning split the sky like axe blows, and thunder rolled through the valley with enough force to rattle windows and set the cattle to bawling in the far pasture. I'd seen plenty of mountain storms in my 42 years, but this one felt different, charged with a kind of electric fury that made the hair on my arms stand up and my teeth ache. By morning the storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline sky and air so clean it seemed to sing in your lungs. But the wind had done its work during the night, bringing down 3 big pines along the North Trail and opening up a section of forest that had been thick as a curtain for as long as I could remember. I rode out after breakfast to assess the damage, more concerned about blocked paths than any revelation the storm might have uncovered. The fallen trees had created a natural bridge across Pine Creek, their massive trunks spanning the water like the bones of some ancient beast. I was picking my way carefully across the improvised causeway when I noticed something that stopped me cold. Beyond the creek, in a small clearing that had been hidden behind the now fallen timber, stood the weathered remains of an old cabin I'd never seen before, though I'd been walking these woods for 37 years. The structure was barely more than a shell, its roof partially collapsed and its walls silver-grey with age and weather. Judging by the construction and the way the forest had begun to reclaim it, the cabin had been abandoned for decades, maybe longer. Wild roses had grown up around the foundation, their thorny canes weaving through gaps in the chinked logs, and saplings pushed up through the rotted floorboards like green fingers reaching toward the light filtering through the broken roof. I approached the cabin with the careful steps of a man who's learned not to trust appearances, my boots crunching on the carpet of pine needles and fallen leaves that had accumulated around the structure over the years. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, revealing a dim interior that smelled of decay and the particular mustiness that comes from wood slowly returning to the earth from which it came. Inside, the single room was surprisingly intact despite the ravages of time and weather. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold and choked with debris, while a few pieces of crude furniture remained scattered about like the bones of a life long since ended. Sunlight slanted through gaps in the roof, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the still air and casting everything in the golden tones of an old photograph. I was examining the remains of what might have been a table when something caught my eye. something that didn't belong among the detritus of abandonment and decay. There, on a rough wooden shelf near the fireplace, sat an object that made my heart skip like a stone across water. Even covered with dust and tarnished by years of neglect, I recognized it immediately. Jacob's harmonica, the silver instrument that had been our grandfather's and had vanished with my brother 15 years ago. My hands shook as I reached for it, afraid that touching it might make it disappear like some cruel mirage born of wishful thinking and too many years of wondering. But the harmonica was real enough, solid and substantial in my palm, its familiar weight triggering a flood of memories so vivid I had to grip the edge of the shelf to keep from falling. The metal was cold and spotted with verdigris, but when I turned it over, I could still make out the tiny initials our grandfather had scratched into the cover plate. J. M. James Morrison, the man who'd carried this instrument through the Civil War and passed it down to his grandson. I sank down onto what remained of a wooden crate, the harmonica cradled in my hands like a wounded bird, and tried to make sense of what I was seeing. How had Jacob's instrument ended up in this forgotten cabin deep in the pine woods? Had he discovered this place during one of his solitary walks and somehow lost the harmonica here? But if so, where was Jacob himself? The cabin showed no signs of recent habitation, no indication that anyone had lived here within the last several decades. The dust on the shelf where I'd found the harmonica was thick and undisturbed, except for the rectangular outline where the instrument had lain, suggesting it had been placed there long ago and left untouched by human hands ever since. But the harmonica itself, while tarnished and dirty, showed no signs of the severe corrosion I would have expected from 15 years of exposure to the elements. It was a puzzle that made my head ache and my heart race with possibilities I didn't dare name. I carried the harmonica home in my shirt pocket, right where Jacob used to keep it, the metal warming against my chest as I rode through the afternoon shadows. Rachel took one look at my face when I walked through the kitchen door and knew immediately that something had changed, that the careful equilibrium of our lives had been knocked off balance by whatever I'd found in the woods. She didn't ask questions right away, just poured me a cup of coffee and waited for me to find the words. When I finally placed the harmonica on the kitchen table between us, Rachel's breath caught in her throat like a sob. She'd never known Jacob personally, but she'd heard enough stories and seen enough photographs to recognize the instrument that had been as much a part of my brother as his own shadow. Her fingers hovered over the tarnished metal without quite touching it, as if she understood that this was something too fragile and too important to be handled carelessly. The children were at school, so we had the house to ourselves and the luxury of silence to process what this discovery might mean. I told Rachel about the cabin, describing every detail I could remember, trying to make sense of how Jacob's most precious possession had ended up in a place neither of us had known existed. She listened without interruption, her teacher's mind working through the possibilities, sorting facts from speculation with the same careful precision she used to explain arithmetic to her students. That evening after supper, when Emma and Thomas had finished their homework and been sent off to bed, I finally worked up the courage to clean the harmonica and see if it would still play. Rachel watched from her chair by the fire as I used a soft cloth to remove 15 years of dust and neglect, revealing the silver surface that had once gleamed like water in sunlight. The reeds inside appeared undamaged, and when I finally raised the instrument to my lips, it responded with the same sweet, clear tone I remembered from childhood. The first notes I played were tentative, almost fearful, but as my fingers found their way across the familiar holes and chambers, muscle memory took over, and I found myself playing one of Jacob's favorite tunes, a slow, mournful melody he'd learned from a traveling musician who'd wintered at our ranch when we were boys. The music filled the kitchen like smoke, carrying with it the weight of all the years and all the questions that had accumulated in Jacob's absence. Rachel wiped tears from her cheeks as the last notes faded into silence, and I realized I was crying too, though I couldn't say whether it was from joy at hearing that music again or sorrow at being reminded of all we'd lost. The harmonica felt both foreign and familiar in my hands, like returning to a childhood home that had been altered by time and abandonment. I could play it, but it would never be mine the way it had been Jacob's, never sing with quite the same voice that had once drifted through our evenings like prayers. Over the following days, I found myself returning to that hidden cabin again and again, searching for some clue that might explain how the harmonica had ended up there. I examined every inch of the structure, looking for signs of Jacob's presence, some indication that he'd lived there or at least spent time in that forgotten clearing. But aside from the harmonica itself, the cabin revealed nothing, keeping its secrets as stubbornly as the woods that had hidden it for so many years. I brought a lantern one evening and stayed until after dark, hoping that the changed light might reveal something I'd missed during my daylight explorations. The cabin took on a different character in the lamplight, its shadows deeper and more mysterious, its silence more profound. I sat on the same crate where I'd found the harmonica and played softly, wondering if somehow Jacob might hear the music and know that his instrument had found its way home at last. The melody echoed strangely in the confined space, bouncing off the log walls and returning to me changed, as if the cabin itself was adding harmonies I hadn't intended. For a moment, listening to those reflected notes, I almost believed I could hear another harmonica answering mine from somewhere deep in the woods, playing the same tune in perfect synchronization. But when I stopped playing and held my breath to listen, there was nothing but the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant call of a night bird. I began carrying the harmonica with me everywhere, the way Jacob once had, taking comfort in its familiar weight and the knowledge that this tangible piece of my brother had somehow found its way back to me. The instrument became a talisman of sorts, a connection to mysteries I couldn't solve, but no longer felt compelled to abandon. Sometimes I would play it while working cattle or mending fence, and the music would drift across the pastures like a ghost of better times. But playing Jacob's harmonica also awakened something in me that had been sleeping for 15 years, a restlessness and a hunger for answers that I thought I'd successfully buried. The discovery of the cabin had proven that there were still secrets hidden in the pine woods, still pieces of the puzzle waiting to be found. If I'd overlooked an entire structure for more than a decade, what else might be out there, concealed by shadows and time and the forest's talent for keeping what it chose to keep? The town's old records were kept in the basement of the courthouse, filed away in wooden cabinets that smelled of must and forgotten years. I spent 3 Saturdays down there with the dust and the spiders, searching through deed transfers and tax assessments, trying to find some mention of the cabin that had somehow escaped my notice for 37 years. The clerk, a thin man named Pettigrew, who'd been filing papers since before I was born, helped me navigate the maze of documentation with the patient air of someone who understood that the past sometimes demanded excavation. We found it finally, buried in a stack of homestead claims from 1864, a quarter section registered to one Ezra Thornfield, a prospector who'd apparently tried his luck at both gold mining and cattle ranching before abandoning his claim in 1871. The property had reverted to federal ownership and been incorporated into the national forest, which explained why I'd never seen it on any local maps. According to the records, Thornfield's cabin had been built near Pine Creek, on a small clearing that matched the location where I'd found Jacob's harmonica. Pettigrew produced a territorial survey map from 1868 that showed Thornfield's claim in relation to the other homesteads in the valley, including the land that would eventually become our family ranch. The cabin was marked with a small square and the notation "Dwelling 1 Room," along with symbols indicating a well and what appeared to be a small outbuilding, probably a shed or stable. Seeing it laid out on paper like that, I wondered how my father and grandfather had never mentioned the abandoned homestead, though perhaps it had been forgotten by the time our family arrived in the valley. I copied down everything I could find about Ezra Thornfield, though the records were frustratingly sparse. He'd filed his claim in the spring of 1864, paid taxes for 7 years, and then simply disappeared from the official documentation. There was no record of him selling the property or filing any kind of transfer, no death certificate or probate filing. Like Jacob, Ezra Thornfield had simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and the slowly rotting remains of whatever life he'd tried to build in that hidden clearing. The similarity between the two disappearances wasn't lost on me, though I tried not to read too much significance into the parallel. Men had been vanishing in the wilderness for as long as there had been wilderness to vanish into, and most of them had perfectly rational explanations for their absence, even if those explanations never came to light. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that finding Jacob's harmonica in Thornfield's abandoned cabin was more than simple coincidence. I began making regular trips to the local library, a small building that Rachel had helped establish when she first came to teach in our valley. The librarian, Mrs. Patterson, was a woman who understood the value of both books and the stories they contained, and she helped me search through old newspapers and territorial documents for any mention of Ezra Thornfield or other disappearances in the area. We found references to several men who'd gone missing over the years, prospectors and trappers mostly, but nothing that seemed to connect to Jacob's case. One evening, while I was reading through a collection of letters donated by one of the valley's founding families, I discovered something that made my blood run cold with recognition. The letter was dated October 15th, 1871, written by a woman named Margaret Sawyer to her sister back in Ohio, and it mentioned Ezra Thornfield's sudden departure from the valley. But what caught my attention was her description of Thornfield as a quiet man who played the most beautiful music on a silver harmonica, melodies that seemed to carry all the loneliness of these mountains. The letter went on to describe how Thornfield had been found of taking long walks in the pine woods, often staying out past sunset, returning with that distant look in his eyes that suggested he was wrestling with something larger than himself. The parallels to Jacob were so precise, they made my hands shake as I held the fragile paper up to the lamplight. Even the physical description matched: a young man in his 20s, with dark eyes and capable hands. Someone who seemed more at home in the wilderness than in the company of other people. Margaret Sawyer's final reference to Thornfield was dated 3 days before he disappeared, and her words seemed to reach across the decades with prophetic clarity. Ezra has been different these past weeks, playing music I've never heard before, melodies that sound like goodbye. I fear these mountains are calling to him in a language the rest of us cannot understand, and I worry that one day he will answer that call and never return to tell us what he found. That night I lay awake beside Rachel, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of what I'd discovered. 2 men, separated by decades, both drawn to the same isolated woods, both carrying the same instrument, both disappearing without explanation or trace. The rational part of my mind insisted it was coincidence, that I was allowing grief and desperation to create patterns where none existed. But another part of me, a part that had grown stronger since finding the harmonica, whispered that some mysteries ran deeper than logic could fathom. I began playing the harmonica more frequently, especially during my walks in the pine woods, letting the music drift through the trees like a question asked of the shadows. Sometimes I would stop at the abandoned cabin and play there, sitting on the same crate where I'd made my discovery, wondering if the music might somehow bridge the gap between past and present, between the living and the lost. The melodies that came from the instrument seemed to choose themselves, rising from some deep well of memory and longing that I couldn't consciously access. Winter came early that year, settling over the valley like a familiar but unwelcome guest. Snow fell thick and steady for 3 days, transforming the pine woods into a cathedral of white silence that made my footsteps sound like gunshots in the crystal air. I found myself walking the trails more often than ever, drawn by a restlessness I couldn't name and didn't fully understand. The harmonica warm in my shirt pocket, like a compass pointing toward mysteries I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. The cabin looked different under its burden of snow, smaller somehow and more fragile, as if the winter was slowly erasing it from existence. Ice hung from the broken eaves like crystal teeth, and the interior had filled with drifted snow that covered the floor in pristine white curves and shadows. I swept out a small space near the fireplace and built a fire from the dry wood that still lay scattered around the hearth, needing the warmth and comfort of flame as much as the light it provided. Sitting by that fire, with Jacob's harmonica in my hands and the weight of everything I'd learned pressing down on my shoulders, I finally allowed myself to consider the possibility that had been growing in my mind like a tumor. What if the woods themselves were somehow responsible for the disappearances, not in any supernatural sense, but in the way that some places seem to call to certain kinds of people, drawing them deeper and deeper until they lose themselves completely? I'd known men who'd been claimed by the wilderness, good men who'd simply walked too far into the wild country and never found their way back. The mountains were full of bones and stories, testament to the fact that nature didn't distinguish between the prepared and the foolish, between those who respected its power and those who underestimated its indifference. Perhaps Jacob and Ezra Thornfield had simply been 2 more casualties of that eternal struggle between human ambition and the remorseless wild. But as I played softly by the firelight, letting the harmonica's voice fill the empty cabin with echoes of the past, I knew that explanation wasn't enough. There was something more deliberate about these disappearances, something that suggested choice rather than accident. Both men had been musicians, both had been drawn to solitary walks in the same stretch of forest, both had vanished at times when they seemed to be struggling with some internal conflict that others couldn't understand. The fire burned low while I sat there thinking, its light fading to coals that cast shifting shadows on the log walls. In that half-darkness, with the harmonica's music still hanging in the air like smoke, I began to understand something that I'd been avoiding for 15 years. Jacob hadn't gotten lost in the woods, hadn't fallen victim to accident or misfortune. He'd made a choice, followed some calling that had been growing stronger each day until finally he couldn't resist it anymore. The harmonica he'd left behind wasn't a clue to be solved, but a message to be understood. It was his way of saying goodbye, of leaving something of himself for those who would come looking. Ezra Thornfield had done the same thing decades earlier, and perhaps other men before him, each one called by whatever it was that lived in the deepest part of the pine woods, something that spoke to musicians and dreamers and those who heard melodies in the wind that others couldn't detect. I thought about the restlessness that had been growing in me since finding the harmonica, the way the music seemed to pull me deeper into the woods with each passing day. Was I feeling the same call that had claimed Jacob and Thornfield? Was the forest slowly working its influence on me, the way water works on stone, patient and persistent and ultimately irresistible? The thought should have terrified me, but instead it brought a strange kind of peace, as if a question I'd been carrying for 15 years had finally been answered. When the fire finally died to ash and darkness filled the cabin completely, I made my way home through the snow-covered woods by moonlight, the harmonica still warm in my pocket and a new understanding heavy in my chest. I wouldn't tell Rachel what I'd realized, wouldn't burden her with the knowledge that some mysteries weren't meant to be solved, but simply accepted. She had enough to worry about with the children and the ranch and the ordinary challenges of daily life. But I would keep walking in the woods, keep playing Jacob's harmonica in the places where he'd once walked, because now I understood that this was my role in the story. I was the keeper of the music, the one who would preserve the melodies until it was my turn to follow them into whatever waited beyond the last familiar trail. The harmonica would outlast me, just as it had outlasted Thornfield and Jacob, waiting in its forgotten cabin for the next person who would hear its call and understand what it meant. Spring returned to the valley with its usual mixture of hope and hard work, the snow melting to reveal a world washed clean and ready for new beginnings. Emma graduated from the local school that year and announced her intention to attend the Teachers' College in Denver, while Thomas grew another 3 inches and began showing the kind of restless energy that reminded me more of Jacob with each passing day. Rachel threw herself into planning Emma's departure and managing Thomas's boundless curiosity, but I could see her watching me with growing concern as the harmonica's influence continued to work its changes. I'd taken to playing more often and for longer periods, sometimes sitting on the porch for hours as the music drifted across the pastures and into the surrounding woods. The melodies that came from the instrument were increasingly unfamiliar, as if the harmonica was teaching me songs I'd never heard before, ancient tunes that seemed to rise from the mountains themselves. Rachel would listen from the kitchen window, her face troubled by something she couldn't name, but could feel changing the man she'd married. The ranch work continued as it always had. The cattle still needed tending, and the fences still required mending. But I found my attention wandering more and more toward the pine woods and the mysteries they contained. I'd catch myself staring at the tree line during meals, my fork halfway to my mouth, listening for something that might be calling from beyond the familiar world of home and family. The harmonica seemed to grow heavier in my pocket each day, its weight, both comfort and burden, anchor and sail. Thomas began following me on some of my walks, his young legs easily keeping pace as we moved through the familiar trails. He'd inherited Jacob's musical ear along with his restless spirit, and he listened intently when I played the harmonica, sometimes humming along with melodies he'd never heard before but somehow knew. I taught him the songs Jacob had loved, passing down the music like a family inheritance, though I wondered sometimes if I was preparing him for something I didn't fully understand myself. One evening in late May, as we sat by Pine Creek watching the water run clear and cold from the mountains, Thomas asked me the question I'd been dreading and expecting in equal measure. He wanted to know about his uncle Jacob, not the sanitized stories we'd told him growing up, but the truth about what had happened in these woods 15 years ago. I looked at his earnest young face, so much like Jacob's at that age, and realized that the time for comfortable lies had passed. I told him everything then, about Jacob's restlessness and his final walk into the woods, about the harmonica and the abandoned cabin, and the man named Ezra Thornfield who'd vanished decades before. Thomas listened without interruption, his eyes growing wide with understanding as the pieces of the story fell into place. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring into the darkening woods with an expression that made my heart ache with recognition. The conversation changed something between us, created a new intimacy based on shared knowledge and mutual respect. Thomas began asking more questions about the music, wanting to learn not just the melodies but their history, their connection to the family and the land, and the mysteries that lay hidden in the shadows. I taught him everything I could, knowing somehow that this knowledge would be important for him in ways I couldn't yet foresee. As summer progressed, I found myself drawn more frequently to the abandoned cabin, sometimes staying there for hours at a time, playing the harmonica and listening to its voice echo off the weathered walls. The forest seemed to respond to the music, birds falling silent when I played certain melodies, the wind shifting direction as if the trees themselves were leaning in to listen. I began to understand why Jacob had been so drawn to these solitary walks, how the wilderness could offer a kind of communion that civilization couldn't provide. Rachel grew increasingly worried as my behavior became more erratic, my attention more divided between the world of family and responsibility and whatever was calling from the deep woods. She'd find me standing at the window in the early hours before dawn, staring out at the tree line with the harmonica in my hands. And I could see the fear in her eyes, that she was losing me the same way we'd lost Jacob. But I couldn't explain what I was feeling without sounding like a madman, couldn't put into words the growing certainty that something was waiting for me in the forest. The harmonica had become more than an instrument by then. It was a voice speaking in a language older than words, telling stories that had been accumulating in its silver chambers for generations. Each time I played, I felt myself being drawn deeper into those stories, becoming part of a narrative that stretched back through Thornfield and Jacob, and perhaps other men whose names had been forgotten by everyone except the woods themselves. The music was a thread connecting past and present, the living and the lost, and I was both following it and being followed by it towards some destination I couldn't see but was no longer afraid to reach. The morning I finally understood what Jacob had been hearing in the woods, Rachel found me on the porch at dawn, with the harmonica in my lap and tears on my cheeks. She didn't ask what was wrong because she could see in my face that nothing was wrong anymore, that I'd finally found the answer to the question that had been haunting our family for 15 years. The music had shown me something during the night, a vision as clear as mountain water, and I knew at last why my brother had walked into those woods and never returned. It wasn't madness that had claimed Jacob, or accident, or even the simple call of the wild that takes some men when civilization grows too confining. It was something far more beautiful and terrible than that. Something that only those who carried the music in their blood could truly understand. The harmonica wasn't just an instrument but a key, and the pine woods weren't just forest but a doorway. And some people were meant to walk through that doorway when their time came, leaving their music behind for others to follow. I'd felt it myself that night, sitting in the abandoned cabin with Jacob's harmonica singing its ancient songs into the darkness. The forest had revealed its secret at last, not in words or visions, but in pure understanding that flowed through the music like water through stone. There was a place beyond the familiar trails, beyond the mapped and measured world, where the music went when it was done with earthly instruments, and Jacob had found that place 15 years ago. Rachel sat beside me on the porch steps, her hand warm on my shoulder, and together we watched the sun rise over the pine ridge where my brother had disappeared. I played softly, letting the harmonica's voice drift across the morning air like a prayer or a benediction. And for the first time in 15 years, the music sounded complete. No longer searching for something lost, but celebrating something found. The melody rose and fell with the rhythm of breathing, with the pulse of life itself, carrying within its silver chambers all the stories of those who'd played it before me. Thomas emerged from the house as the song ended, his young face serious with the weight of understanding that had been growing in him all summer. He sat on the steps below me and listened as I told him and Rachel what I'd learned in the cabin, how the music was passed down not just through generations, but through the very landscape itself, how some people were chosen to carry it forward while others were called to carry it home. The harmonica would stay with our family, I explained, but its ultimate destination was always the same. I spent the rest of that day teaching Thomas everything I could about the music, showing him not just how to play the songs, but how to listen for the deeper melodies that live beneath the surface. He had the gift. I could see it in the way his fingers found the right holes without thinking, in the way his breathing naturally matched the rhythm of the mountain wind. The harmonica would be his when my time came, and he would carry it forward until his own understanding was complete. The abandoned cabin became our secret classroom over the following weeks, a place where Thomas could learn the full history of the instrument and the men who'd carried it before us. I told him about Ezra Thornfield and the others who'd answered the music's call, helping him understand that this wasn't a curse or a tragedy, but a completion, a fulfillment of something that had been building for generations. The music was larger than any individual player, and serving it was both honor and responsibility. Rachel watched our lessons with a mixture of pride and sorrow, understanding that she was witnessing the passing of something precious from father to son, but knowing also that this knowledge came with a cost she wasn't sure she was prepared to pay. She never asked me directly when I thought my time would come, but I could see the question in her eyes every evening when I returned from the woods with the harmonica in my pocket and that distant look that she'd learned to recognize. Emma wrote from college that fall, her letters full of excitement about her studies and plans for the future, and I was grateful that distance had spared her from witnessing the changes in our family. She remembered her Uncle Jacob as a figure from childhood stories, romantic and mysterious, but safely contained in the past. Let her keep that version, I thought. Let her build her life without the weight of understanding that was slowly settling on Thomas's young shoulders. As winter approached again, I found myself playing more often in the cabin, sometimes joined by Thomas, sometimes alone with nothing but the firelight and the harmonica's voice to keep me company. The music had grown richer and more complex, incorporating melodies I was certain I'd never heard before, but somehow knew by heart. The instrument was teaching me its final lessons, preparing me for whatever came next, and I accepted that preparation with the peace of a man who'd finally found his purpose. The last entry I made in my journal was simple and clear, written on a cold December morning when the snow lay thick on the ground and the pine woods called with voices I could no longer ignore. "The music is complete," I wrote. "It's time to take it home." I left the journal on the kitchen table next to a letter for Rachel and another for Thomas, along with instructions for finding the cabin and caring for the harmonica when its music called to him in turn. Some stories, I realized, were meant to continue long after their original tellers had walked beyond the last familiar trail into whatever harmony waited in the deep woods where all music eventually returns to rest.
If you like this story, leave a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next stories.